A decade before large numbers of Irish and German immigrants began arriving, New York City in appearance still resembled a Dutch village with its church spires and step-gabled houses clustered on the tip of Manhattan. The first New Yorkers, like the great proportion of American colonists, were middle class. Most significantly for the city's future, they were Dutch middle class, and therefore free to concentrate their energies on the pursuit of commerce and trade, untroubled by the religious issues which preoccupied their fellow colonists in New England and Pennsylvania. After the Revolution, New York flirted for a while with the notion of becoming a national capital, but the lure of political intrigue could not compete with the passion for trade. Since the completion of the Erie Canal, New York became more of what it had always been, a city of merchants. The Potomac got the capital, and the port at the mouth of the Hudson got the New York Stock Exchange. New Yorkers seemed to love the gambling of investment, the buying and selling of mortgages, promissory notes, bonds, and IOUs. The stock exchange dating back to 1792 was an ideal place to absorb the wealth that began to accumulate, and besides, there was not much else at hand to buy. For the next 100 years, this speculative form of business had its ups and downs. Boom years followed bust. The Herald admonished New Yorkers during the Panic of 1837 for the habit which all classes seem to have contracted of speculating beyond their means, of living beyond their income. In truth, the apparent conflict between the democratic spirit and the pursuit of wealth was something that sorely troubled our founding fathers and gave men like Jefferson, Franklin, and Adams pause. The author of the Declaration of Independence and the framers of the Bill of Rights were themselves astounded by the power of the machinery they had set in motion. That free men seemed determined to become rich men was something more than they had bargained for.
In 1985, we're going to have the convention center completed. It's going to have 1 million square feet of floor space available for displays on one floor. That's the equivalent of 11 football fields. You go outside and ask the person in the street where is the New York City Convention Center, maybe 1 out of 4 will know. In any other community, they're putting up a $400 million development. It'd be a major, every taxi cab driver, every bartender, every barber, every manicurist, they'd know where the convention center is. Oh, I think it's uptown somewhere.
In the aftermath of the War of 1812, there had been a building boom in all the major American cities. Immigrants, many of them Irish, had flocked to supply the strong backs and willing hands which the new urban construction required. In time, buildings slackened. Still, they came. Too many, it seemed, for the economy to absorb. In a desperate attempt to stem the tide, the state legislature passed a law requiring ship captains to report all passengers to the mayor's office. The city required a bond of up to $300 for each person likely to become a public charge. Ships' owners, unwilling to lose profit on the voyage, simply docked farther down the coast below New York Harbor. The human cargo was unloaded and pointed in the right direction and ordered to walk itself into town. The mayor voiced a general concern. It has not been uncommon during the summer to meet droves of these foreigners who have been landed some miles to the east, lugging their chests and beds. Many of these have sunk under the fatigue, and we have now some of them in the almshouse, taken from the road where they could not be left to perish. The Society for the Prevention of Pauperism set up soup kitchens during the harsh winter of 1819-1820. A spokesman explained, "We cannot force them back upon the ocean. We cannot suffer them to starve at our doors. We cannot drive them by force into the shades and fastness of the wilderness. In time, this attitude would change. Even before the Great Wave would begin in the 1830s, sweeping hundreds of thousands west across the Atlantic, an educated German arriving in New York would hear himself and his companions referred to as those damned immigrants. They would continue to come. In the 100 years after the defeat of Napoleon, 35 million Europeans, in the largest mass movement of human beings in the history of the world, would be drawn across the fearful ocean to this sweet and alien land. The vast majority of them, more than 70%, would come first to New York. For many of them and their children and their children's children, America would be New York, for they would go no farther. To Philip Hone, who had made enough money as an auctioneer to retire at the age of 40, the Irish immigrants huddling in the squalor of the notorious Five Points district were a visual, moral, and economic affront. They increase our taxes, eat our bread, and encumber our streets, and not 1 in 20 is competent to keep himself, he complained to his diary. In 1825, the year of the opening of the Erie Canal, 11% of New York City's population were foreign-born. Many of these had come to build the canal, railroads, ships, houses, stores, and factories as the city's and the nation's economy surged forward in a wave of optimistic expansion. "Tell Thomas Aaron to come to America," one English immigrant wrote, "and tell him to leave his strap what he wears when he has nothing to eat in England for some other half-starved slave. Tell Miriam there's no sending children to bed without supper or husbands to work without dinner in their bags." The optimism vanished with the panic of 1837, precipitating a 6-year period of financial paralysis, the worst economic disaster faced by the United States until the Great Depression of 1929. In New York, the situation was aggravated by the Great Fire of 1835. It was 3 days before the last spark sputtered to extinction, leaving 52 acres of lower Manhattan real estate gutted or totally destroyed. Many fire insurance firms, unable to repay on their policies, went out of business and numerous banks closed. Lending sources dried up and factory and store owners were unable to find the capital to rebuild. Land speculation had run wild. Encouraged by the success of New York with the Erie Canal, other states had piled up huge debts to finance extensive public works. President Andrew Jackson called for all payment for government land to be in silver or gold, and credit became even tighter. European bankers who had come into the American money market called in their loans. Terror ran through the financial community, and the banks hired thugs to guard their doors with orders to fire on the crowds if necessary. In contrast to the commotion in the streets, it was quiet behind the closed doors of the trading community. Philip Hone, the diarist and auctioneer, who was to lose 2/3 of his fortune in the decline, observed, "All is still as death, no business transacted." With only 1/3 of his capital intact, the retired Hone was able to enjoy still a handsome supper with oceans of champagne. Cornelius Vanderbilt, who had promoted himself from ferry boat captain to commodore, had no trouble maintaining the largest fleet of steamers on Long Island Sound. John Jacob Astor was collecting enough in New York rents to lend a friend $250,000. As the Depression deepened, shipbuilding ceased, construction ground to a halt, and thousands were thrown out of work. Anti-foreign and especially anti-Irish sentiment began to grow. The city's first organized criminal gang, the 40 Thieves, was born in 1826 in the back room of Rosanna Pierre's vegetable stall. The Five Points district on which they preyed had been deteriorating since 1820. It took its name from the spot where 5 streets came together on the site of the old Collect or freshwater pond. When loosely packed landfill began to yield to the weight of the buildings, middle-class families departed for other areas of the city. The district became the exclusive province of the Irish, who quickly became identified with the horrifying conditions in which they lived. Both typical and symbolic of the neighborhood was the old brewery, which was converted to become the city's worst tenement in 1837. First known as Coulter's Brewery, the 5-story structure had been erected in 1792 on the shore of the Collect Pond, and for many years had produced a beer considered the best in the eastern states. Later, when it became a landmark of the slum gathered around its walls, it was described as resembling a giant toad with dirty, leprous warts squatting happily in the filth and squalor of the points. Most people viewed the Irish like the old brewery itself, wallowing contentedly in dirt and degradation except for periodic forays with bludgeons and blades during which they wrought untold mischief, mostly upon themselves, for fun and profit. The violence which erupted in the streets of the city during the flower riots of 1837, the theater riots of 1849, and the draft riots of 1863 could not excite much apprehension in men who would break a stranger's back in 3 places on a $2 bet, or crack an old man's skull just to make an even 50 nicks on the handle of a stick. Fights between rival gangs were fights to the finish, as might be expected of people who had nothing to lose. Dandy Johnny Dolan, who invented the copper wedges he wore on his thumbs for gouging out eyes, also initiated the practice of putting blades in the soles of his boots to increase the gore when trampling on a foe. Like other gang leaders, he commanded the absolute allegiance of hundreds of men who could be counted upon to make any battle of his their own.
The church where we are is called St. Patrick's Old Cathedral. It's the predecessor of the cathedral on Fifth Avenue and 50th Street. And construction began here on this cathedral in 1809. It continued up until the year 1815, and from that time up until 1879, when the new cathedral on Fifth Avenue was opened. This was the primary, the most important church of the Catholic people in New York. We're here in the vault of Old St. Patrick's Cathedral. Each vault is able to hold approximately 12 or so burials, and families would purchase the vaults as a resting place for the members of their family. In 1809, when they first began constructing the cathedral, the composition was no doubt heavily Irish, and it continued that way up through the time of the Great Hunger in Ireland in the 1840s, when so many came to the United States seeking relief from the crop failure there. There was a lot of tension in the 1840s and 1850s among Catholics and non-Catholics in New York.
The moral character of the Irish was publicly defended by the Tammany politicians, who offered them protection, expedited naturalization procedures, provided lawyers and bail bondsmen, and pulled strings to secure licenses and prevent raids on Irish-owned saloons, all in return for their loyal votes on Election Day. Craggy-faced John Hughes, who became coadjutor bishop of New York in 1837, would spearhead the drive to build St. Patrick's Cathedral. But his most important contribution to the Irish community was neither religious nor architectural. In 1841, having been thwarted by both the city council and the state legislature in his drive to get public funds for Catholic schools, he decided to form the first and only Catholic political party in the history of the United States. By marshaling Catholics in the city to support a slate of candidates openly pledged to the position of the church, he succeeded in splitting the Democratic vote so badly that the Whig candidates slipped through by a narrow margin. Tammany was faced with the realization that they would have to offer more than charity and legal aid to the Irish to retain political control of the city. Tammany was forced to open the upper rungs of the patronage ladder to them for the first time, and even consider running Irish candidates for elected office. Philip Hone wrote that John Hughes merited a cardinal's hat at least for what he has done in placing Irish Catholics on the necks of New Yorkers. Hughes was never elected to the Pope's council, but later he did become Archbishop when, to the horror of native Protestants, New York was elevated to an archdiocese by Pius IX. In 1811, a commission appointed to come up with a plan for Manhattan's growth arrived at a grid pattern laid out in 12 avenues, north and south, and 155 streets running east and west, with the comment, It may be a subject of merriment that the commissioners have provided space for a greater population than is collected any spot this side of China. The grid's purpose was to facilitate the buying, selling, and improving of real estate. Middle Road, a road which had run roughly up the middle of the island, was now called Fifth Avenue, because, counting from east to west, it was the Fifth Avenue. In 1824, a year before the opening of the Erie Canal, the city of 100,000 was already a bustling seaport. The boulevard that was to become a symbol of wealth was opened from Waverly Place to 9th Street. 2 years later, a graveyard for paupers was spaded over and turned into Washington Square. Soon the 7th Regiment was there practicing drills against a background of Gothic spires belonging to New York University, then called the University of the City of New York. The early social life was built around merchant families such as the Roosevelts, the Verplancks, the Brevoorts, the Golets, the Bayards, the Van Cortlands, and the Astors. The descendants of these merchants became an aristocracy that dominated city affairs and came to reside facing one another around Washington Square. Whenever greater numbers of Irish arrived, they quickly filled spaces vacated in areas of lower Manhattan. These dangerous classes, as they were perceived to be by the Washington Square families, were willing to work for almost nothing. As New York's aristocracy began to move up Fifth Avenue, the newcomers provided cheap labor, advancing the roadway in segments above Washington Square, from 13th to 21st Street in 1830, up to 42nd Street by 1837. Additionally, the immigrants crowded into tenements that came to be a lucrative investment for the better families and helped pay for the memorable balls in the grand houses which men like the architect Richard Morris Hunt were to design for them in the coming decades.
Load up the truck. Yeah, it's in front of the building. Kevin! Kevin! Yeah. I got a Haley company here. I wrote it down on the paper. I don't see that Joskies. I don't see it anyplace. There's another Joskies, right?
Yeah, Footwork or
Houston.
Little Rock.
Houston.
Oh, wait, yeah.
I got them all. You think you put 6721 by mistake? You see it, 6721? That's San Antonio?
Yeah.
J60. Howie! Load up the truck. Nope, I don't see it here. What about Joski's at Fort Worth?
People who want beauty, there's certainly more beautiful places. People who want power, success, who want the satisfaction of being in a limousine on a rainy winter evening when everybody else is huddled in the street during the middle of a transit strike with copies of the Daily News over their head. This is the city for that, right? We don't really make anything very much except for little luxury trades, furs, fashion garments. Even then, the garments are not made here, they're designed here. We make news. magazines, deals, careers, celebrities, money.
That money earns money even while you sleep occurred to Joseph Seligman by the late 1850s. Joseph reasoned that the inventory of goods that any merchant is forced to display on the shelves of his store put him at an obvious disadvantage when compared to money loaned and invested that could earn its owner interest and profit around the clock, 365 days a year, including holidays. Gold fever and the mania to build railroads had seized the country and kept stocks booming on Wall Street. August Belmont, a German Jew who in early youth apprenticed himself to the great European private bankers, the House of Rothschild, now headed their Havana operation. With the news of the Panic of 1837, Belmont sailed for New York to buy up stocks at very low prices. As early as 1654, a group of 23 Sephardic Jews had arrived in New Amsterdam from Brazil. Their forebears were forced to leave Spain and Portugal following the Inquisition when they refused to convert to Catholicism. 200 years later, the Sephardic families of New York, the Hendrickses, the Cardozos, the Baruchs, the Lazaruses, the Nathans, Solaces, the Gomezes, the Lopezes, the Lindos, the Lombrosos, and Satiuses had become successful businessmen and a part of New York society. They had served in the Revolutionary War, helped to found the Stock Exchange and many of the early institutions and exclusive clubs of New York City. Young Belmont, despite the unlimited resources of Rothschild money, would not easily be invited into this Jewish upper caste. Unlike Boston or Philadelphia, Anglo-Saxon society in New York under Dutch influence only now was in the process of formulating its own rules of exclusion. August Belmont had a better chance of being accepted here. To gain social status, August Belmont fought a duel that left him with a permanent limp. It served him well when he chose for his bride Caroline, the daughter of Commodore Matthew Perry, responsible for opening Japan to Western trade. Belmont's contribution to New York society in return, in addition to bailing out the U.S. government with Rothschild money from time to time, was to become a teacher of style and an arbiter of taste who quite literally introduced gourmet food to a New York that tended toward 8 courses of heavy, overcooked meals. The mansion on Lower Fifth Avenue, where Belmont moved with his new wife, had New York's first private ballroom, used but one night a year, and a gold service for 200 guests. Many of the Jewish immigrants from Germany who later founded prestigious private banking houses on Wall Street started as foot peddlers. Joseph Seligman arrived in steerage also during the Panic of 1837. Like others, he would bring over his brothers and sisters one by one. The Seligman brothers didn't care how they appeared to others as they tracked across the open countryside, their heavy packs overflowing with goods, their scraggly beards and hair dust-covered, their clothes ill-fitting and shoes cracking under a crust of mud, fighting off snapping dogs and tolerating the jeers of children who pelted them with rocks and called them Sheeny and Christ-killer. Like so many others, the Seligmans were driven by a will, both private and stubborn, to survive and thrive in this new land. The endless waves of immigrants which seemed to energize New York also seemed to cause fine old buildings to decline into slums. And yet this process of rapid disintegration of areas that had once been fashionable had always been characteristic of the city. The colonial house in which George Washington lived as first president soon became part of the slum of Cherry Hill. The aristocratic Chelsea section became Hell's Kitchen, stretching between 23rd to 40th Streets from 7th Avenue to the Hudson River. The once elegant Bond Street became the territory of rag pickers. Later, Italian immigrants were to move into the brownstones of East Harlem and below Houston Street west of the Bowery, forcing blacks to move north into the 30s along 7th Avenue and into the 50s along 9th Avenue, an area that in time would be called San Juan Hill. Chatham Square, Pell, and Mott Streets would become Chinatown. East and south of Chinatown would become home to Greeks. Greenwich and Washington Streets near the Battery would house Turks, Syrians, and Arabs. North along the Bowery would be settled with Germans. Little Hungary took over St. Mark's Place. Below 14th Street, from the Bowery to the East River, was eventually the territory of Russian, Polish, and Romanian Jews.
Well, the Lower East Side at its peak had a population density of something like 150 to 200 people per acre. If the whole of New York City had had that kind of a population, the population of New York City would have been somewhere close to 20 million.
Among the immigrant groups who each in turn settled first on the Lower East Side, many lived out their lives in the growing metropolis without ever crossing 14th Street to venture uptown.
Years ago, this synagogue used to come in on the high holidays by 500-600 people. They had to buy the tickets in the reserve a few weeks before, otherwise they couldn't get no seats.
The world of our fathers is becoming increasingly a cemetery in which these synagogues are almost like giant tombstones, marking the departure of what was once one of the great Jewish communities of the world.
My name is Joseph Weissman. I live in Dover, New Jersey. I came to the United States in 1949 from Lithuania. All my youth I spent as a helper to the famous cantors. During the Holocaust, I lost my family there, and in 1949, I was one of the survivors. I came to America. I never wanted to go into this field of cantorial business because I lost most of my belief, not to God in general, that I couldn't face famous synagogues in America because it started to remind me all the tragedy what I've been through in the old country. I've been into a business, I've been in the jewelry business. In 1949, when I came in, I arrived in New York City. Being in the jewelry business, I came in this area and I looked on this temple and I saw it says, Temple, the name of the people, Lubch, and this is a little town far away, not far away from the city of Vilna, near the Russian, Polish, Lithuanian border, and my heart just bit me like that. And I walked in there and I talked to one of their elderly, and they were pretty active. That was 31 years ago. And I, in a conversation, said, why don't you come and daven and pray with us on the Shabbat? I says, I'll take you up on that. And I come in. He says, would you like to daven, to pray for us? The first part is divided in two parts, the Shabbat. He says, I'll do. And I did it, and then they discovered that I am a cantor. And they offered me a position in here, but I didn't want it. I didn't take it. After I walked out of this temple, of this synagogue, I just was wet and soaked. It was a hot day, that Shabbat, but my eyes was full of tears.
Anti-foreign sentiment continued to grow as the immigrant tide swelled to a flood of 2.5 million in the decade from 1850 to 1860. At least 60 super-secret xenophobic societies flourished in New York under such patriotic titles as the Supreme Order of the Star-Spangled Banner, the Wide Awakes, and the Native Sons of America. From 1857 until his downfall in 1872, William Marcy Tweed saw the gatherings of souls from all ends of the earth as a brilliant tool of democracy. Thousands of immigrants met at the docks were turned into voters in as few as 10 days. They were given hot soup by Tweed's men, a place to sleep, and if there were no jobs, jobs could be created at city expense. At the height of his power, Tweed commanded 12,000 patronage jobs and was taking $1 million a month from the city treasury. Among his public works was the construction of the Tweed Courthouse at Center and Chamber Streets, which took 14 years to build and 12 million tax dollars, or 4 times what it cost to build the English Houses of Parliament. The excess helped pay for Tweed's enormous appetite, which included 2 mistresses, nearly $2 million worth of jewelry for them, and a lavish mansion on Fifth Avenue for his wife and 8 children. Alone, Harper's Weekly and Thomas Nast kept up the pressure against Tweed for almost a year. It was not until James Taylor, an associate of Tweed's in a printing firm, who was also a director of the New York Times, died, that the Times joined Harper's and began presenting a careful investigation of municipal graft. Despite the fact that disgruntled insiders had been feeding information to the Times for more than a year, there was no impulse to put it before the public until Taylor's death. While Tammany distributed turkeys at Christmas, beer and cigars, posted bond, and wept and sang at wakes, old New York, in turn, ignored, then resented these unwashed newcomers until it was necessary to mount a political counteroffensive called reform. Thereafter, reform would alternate with the likes of Tammany Hall in the continuing struggle for power over the city's administration. Tweed denied credit for the urban political machine and claimed, "The fact is that New York politics were always dishonest. There never was a time when you couldn't buy the Board of Aldermen," though Thomas Nast's cartoon image of him and the term boss will always be synonymous with this American innovation. In 1853, Commodore Perry made his first visit to Japan. 30-year-old William Marcy Tweed had just completed his first term as alderman from the 7th Ward, and Caroline Schermerhorn, who was to become the Mrs. Astor, Queen of Society, wed William Astor, a grandson of the fur merchant. John Jacob Astor sold pianos at 149 Broadway and started a modest fur business, leaving to his heirs at his death in 1848 many acres of Manhattan, an enormous fortune, and the regret that he had not invested in more real estate. In the 1850s, the city's skyline consisted of church spires identifying the principal churches as well as its theological bent. Money, as a subject for discussion among the Washington Square aristocrats, was banned from dinner conversation, though horse breeding and sloop racing were acceptable topics. Music and the arts were considered sensual, and though tolerated by church leaders, they carried with them a taint of sinfulness. 4,000 new millionaires arrived in New York City after the Civil War. They went there because it was a place where upward mobility could be purchased. These raw and calloused, big-knuckled men with their new fortunes, a wealth too recently founded on speculation, on the violence of the gold fields and coal pits, and the fraud of railroad bonds, were seasoned, hard-working, permanently squint-eyed businessmen who descended on New York with social ambitions for their wives and their daughters. The society that was not for hire was experiencing considerable jitters over the size and number of these new millionaires. Mrs. William Backhouse Astor took it upon herself, with the advice and guidance of Ward McAllister, to draw up a list of eligible New Yorkers to comprise society. Of the nearly 2,000 names included in the Social Register, first published in 1887, Jewish names were conspicuously absent, though the Sephardim, some of whom were relieved, others resentful, had been part of New York society from its village beginnings. Of the 2,000 eligible, however, less than 400 were invited to Mrs. Astor's annual ball. When the New York Times published the 400 in 1892, Mrs. Belmont, a recent widow and social rival of Mrs. Astor's, was omitted from the list. In 1879, Harper's Weekly dismissed the game of baseball as impossible, complaining that crowds loudly disputed the decisions of the umpire and refused to applaud the visiting team even if they played better. The New York telephone directory was a single card listing the names of 252 wealthy enough to pay the monthly fee. Buildings were generally not higher than 3 stories of red brick and brownstone fronts, though Richard Morris Hunt, a graduate of the Beaux-Arts, returned from France and soon ended the brownstone era when he fearlessly designed a series of grand palaces for the very rich. While the poor dragged their mattresses to rooftops to escape heat, humidity, and the city's fumes, the rich left for Montauk, the Berkshires, the Adirondacks, and Newport.
Welcome to Marble House, and this is the summer home of Mr. and Mrs. William K. Vanderbilt. Mr. Vanderbilt was the grandson of Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, the founder of the family fortune, which was made through shipping and also railroads. The estimated cost was $11 million. $9 million of that was just for the interior, and $7 million of that was just for the marble alone. In August of 1892, when the Vanderbilts opened the house for the first time, Mr. Vanderbilt gave the house to his wife as a gift.
The American Civil War, which had shocked Europeans by its sheer scale of destruction, would also produce great wealth. The idea of settling the West and uniting the nation became the major obsession of a population weary of both war and politics. The railroad was the instrument that could best accomplish this end, and so the railroad became part of this obsession.
He had a factory down in Trenton, and he rolled the first steel beams, which were the tracks for the trains. He makes glue. You know, money came from making glue. He invented the process for making Jell-O.
Peter Cooper had a vision. In 1859, he created a tuition-free school for those who had the ability to pass the entrance requirements.
It's the last private institution in America that gives a tuition-free education to its students.
Built near the Lower East Side, Cooper Union served successive waves of immigrants well into the 20th century.
And he said, I would leave my family when I died I think 96, something like that. He was president all those years. He said, I will leave them sufficient funds, you know, to satisfy their needs, and not more. And then I will then give the rest to this institution.
At the heart of the school was the auditorium.
But Lincoln then, of course, gave his major Civil War speech, Right Makes Might. The women's suffrage movement started down here. Things like that, the labor movement. So it has a really great tradition of that kind of, which I would call really profoundly social acts.
In February 1860, Abraham Lincoln was just one of many presidential hopefuls. His speech in Peter Cooper's Great Hall was critical. It stirred a chord among many Easterners, and 3 months later, he would become the Republican Party's nominee.
And I want to get back to the idea of the type of men that everybody said, oh, they make faces. These guys were very interesting, is that they really were interested in education, and they supported it disinterestedly. You know, they wanted to simply help people, which is like a almost banal thing to say today. You know, it's immodest to say to help people, because when everybody's help people, everybody holds on to their wallets and they run down the street. But people like Cooper, hey, he just sat there. And you know what was so interesting? He had an idea that he translated into a reality that had ultimately a spiritual significance. That is still in existence, there's still a smell of something going on. And that's the only, I think Le Corbusier said that, right? He said the only thing transferable is thought, which is a beautiful idea, right? I mean, buildings disappear, even people disappear. But the only thing transferable is thought.
The era of great opulence on Fifth Avenue drew to an end around the time of World War I. Most of the mansions were torn down just before or after World War II. Before she died in 1908, Mrs. Astor often stood bejeweled in her empty mansion, greeting by name one imaginary guest after another. A population of 500,000 restless New Yorkers ensured by 1850 that the noise of horse-drawn transportation never abated. Pedestrians, too, thronged both sides of Broadway from Bowling Green to Astor Place. Day and night, traffic never stopped. At the Women's Rights Convention, Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucy Stone demanded the vote. The city had already installed gas lights above 30th Street. The giant Egyptian-style Croton Aqueduct at 42nd and 5th Avenue, where the library now stands, brought water from the Croton River 40 miles away. Of the 400,000 immigrants who arrived in New York in 1853, 119,000 were German. The Germans were drawn to city life, but also to the West and to agriculture. An 18-year-old German who later anglicized his name to Henry Villard and who would become one of America's foremost railroad promoters did not speak a word of English when he traveled west to his uncle's farm in Illinois. 5 years later, he was reporting on the first of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. In time, he would emerge as a respected journalist who risked his life on the battlefields of the Civil War, covered Lee's surrender, and the Lincoln assassination. Upon the close of the war, a nation of avid newspaper readers followed daily, telegraphed progress reports of America's ablest engineers who used the labor of thousands of Chinese to complete track at the astonishing rate of 8 miles a day. Strips of iron laid end to end were being installed in all directions, sometimes running parallel only a few miles apart, with the result that competing railroads driving one another to ruin left many a mile of rusted-out tracks going nowhere. Into this world of railroad finance stepped Henry Villard. Henry had himself appointed as receiver of Jay Gould's bankrupt Kansas Pacific, which he purchased for 10 cents a share, then added several defunct lines so that the railroads he controlled stretched from Maine to Oregon. It was the understanding of this process of reviving an apparently valueless railroad franchise through the manipulation on paper of its assets versus its liabilities that allowed Villard to come into the kind of fortune needed to hire a Stanford White to design and build the Renaissance Palace that survives today as part of the Helmsley Palace Hotel. Villard's first fortune was lost before he could take possession of his mansion. By the time his railroads became overextended and defaulted a second time, Villard understood that a corporation could become bankrupt endlessly, though he himself need not suffer the loss of his personal fortune in the process. The national enthusiasm for building railroads continued to grow, and men like Villard, Vanderbilt, Harriman, Gould, and Fisk quickly understood the fortunes to be made by financing this national passion. In time, the Wall Street manipulations of stocks and bonds would make America a province of New York. And, of course, there were also detractors. On the west side, near 14th Street, in an area that is now the wholesale meat market, Herman Melville was forced to work as a customs inspector after the failure of his monumental book, Moby Dick. In the flush of the Industrial Revolution, Americans didn't want to hear about good and evil, about the wreckage left behind in the search for the great white whale. So complete was his lack of popularity that at his death in 1891, his obituary in a New York newspaper carried the wrong name.
What's that going to do to the red?
It will give it a highlight.
The effect I want, the tone in the print is very important because I want that feeling of the light coming in. So we're going to have, on the second, when we put this back in the acid.
You mean the shadow?
Yes, we want this to really go quite dark then on the second to give the
Yeah.
effect of the.
Ooh la la. Right.
Very nice.
That's nice. I thought the color would be darker.
You did, yeah.
Really? That's fabulous.
Yeah? Very nice. But
Yeah. Yeah, it came out very nice here. See?
No problem here, huh?
Right.
They wouldn't cover that.
You covered here.
Okay,
Start shrinking.
fine. That's strong.
Strong still?
Yeah.
New York has long been considered a cultural capital. This is because New Yorkers have enthusiastically met the first requirement of cultural capitals by elevating the act of selling to a fine art. From this spiritual stuff has come a steady stream of art products.
Conceivably, we should keep this color, add some red
To the blue.
to the blue. My experience has been that the first time you see it, you know, you're sort of shocked by it.
Yeah.
Herman Melville writes, "However the old sea captains may order me about, however they thump and punch me about, I have the satisfaction of knowing that it is all right, that everybody else is, in one way or other, served in much the same way, either in a physical or metaphysical point of view, that is. And so the universal thump is passed around, and all hands should rub each other's shoulder blades and be content." The length of Central Park, stretching 2½ miles to 110th Street, once the village of Harlem, founded by the Dutch in 1658, and the half-mile width between Central Park West and Fifth Avenue, was assembled by 1856 and purchased by the city for $5.5 million. Landscaping began the next year. The winning design for the park, one of 33 submitted, was by Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux. Because the site was a pestilential spot where miasmic odors taint every breath of air, it was available. 4,000 Irish laborers planted 500,000 trees, dug the lakes, and graded the drives, walks, and bridle paths. Once the more and more elaborate mansions of limestone and marble began their relentless march up Fifth Avenue, it would have been impossible for the city to put together the huge 840-acre parcel. What became a park in 1876, shared by rich and poor, would have soon become a priceless piece of real estate. Instead, Central Park became a priceless garden view for those who could afford to own the mansions and rent the apartment houses that continued north along its borders.
The restaurant was started in 1882 by August Luchow. This was the center of the theater. All New York theater was on 14th Street then. And this is also the place where Diamond Jim Brady met Lillian Russell. Diamond Jim Brady was a fat man who really loved to eat huge amounts of food, and he would make bets with Luchow as to how much he could consume.
There had always been rich men like Jim Fisk, shot by his mistress's lover, or later men like Diamond Jim Brady, big spenders who lived as lavishly as old New York had come to live, but who were considered flashy and boorish, consorting with equally gaudy companions, women of stunning beauty, often performers on the musical stage. By accident or inclination, New York had become the focus of the creation and distribution of the nation's wealth. First as a port, then as the terminal for America's railroads and for the pyramids of stocks and bonds to finance them. Shops, restaurants, and theaters, purveyors of luxury, all appeared like magnets, determined to attract the money that poured in, changed hands, and then poured out again. After 100 years on 14th Street, Luchow's restaurant moved uptown. Men like Diamond Jim Brady seemed oblivious to the dictates of Mrs. Astor and the summer retreat of Newport, Rhode Island. They preferred Saratoga Springs, once the queen of American resorts, now attended by the Newport crowd only during the racing season. At the point when the Grand Union Hotel in Saratoga began losing business in the late 1870s, its owners decided on a policy of excluding Jews, blaming them for the loss of its customers. Joseph Seligman, who personally suffered a humiliation because of the sudden change of policy, brought the incident to public attention, the first widely publicized case of anti-Semitism in America. The resulting tensions would affect Jewish life in New York for decades, making official policies of exclusion on both sides. The Italians replaced the Irish as a target of anti-Catholic hatred in America, even though the Irish and German-dominated church was quite unfriendly to these newcomers. Often driven from their homeland in desperation, they quickly gained a reputation for hard work, self-reliance, and frugality, qualities that appealed to employers looking for a new source of cheap labor to replace the older and more demanding one. To quote a government report of 1901, "Where an Irishman or a German demands meat, an Italian will work upon staple bread and beer." By the 1880s, the Italians were taking over tenements from the Irish, and according to Jacob Riis, were welcomed because, as tenants, they make less trouble.
We're standing in 5 Points, and or what was 5 Points, which was the heart of what almost every observer of the 19th century agreed was the worst slum in New York at the time, and probably in all of New York's history. Originally, its population was overwhelmingly Irish. Over time, there was an influx of blacks to increasingly Italian, a population whose presence was so overwhelming that this was indeed part of Little Italy.
Italians, you know, now it's all Chinese. But the neighborhood's changed a lot, to tell you the truth, really. China Chinese come in, and they got sort of like really expanded here, you know? Made a lot of money, you know, everything's going their way. Like, as a matter of fact, I wish I was Chinese. I was gonna get an operation to slam my eyes, you know? It's the truth. But they really made it.
And one of the more interesting aspects of the present Mulberry Street, which is really the hard core of what remains of Little Italy, was a conversion into a tourist area with an emphasis upon restaurant, with a growing amount of Chinese capital being invested in these restaurants, which means, in effect, the Chinese have invested in keeping at least a segment of Little Italy intact because it's profitable.
In 1902, a critic writes of the city's saw-tooth skyline. In all this monster collection of buildings, there is no suggestion of any community of interest. Every skyscraper proclaims as far as it can be seen that it does not recognize any other skyscraper except as a possible rival to be overtopped by the addition of several more stories or a cupola or two. The idea for the white porticos that appeared throughout the newly United States following the Revolutionary War came from the temples of Greece and Rome. Thomas Jefferson, the possessor of the finest architectural library in the colonies, dreamed of a national architecture in classic style that represented a return to nature and the freedom of natural man. The simplicity of the classic eventually gave way to the influence of Romanticism and to a revolt against what was considered by some to be pagan forms. Priests and their parishioners demanded a return to Christian architecture of the Middle Ages, the Gothic form which reappeared in Trinity Church on Wall Street and in St. Patrick's Cathedral. The Flatiron, rising over Madison Square in 1902 in its pie-shaped building site, was reviewed by one critic as a building without a main facade, and we would not be astonished if the whole triangular block would suddenly begin to move northward through the crowd of pedestrians and traffic, breaking like the waves of the ocean on the huge prow-like angle. In the 1880s, it became possible to make buildings higher because it was no longer necessary to support the structure with a thick masonry base and walls. Instead, a frame of steel could be hung with a material that became the exterior building or skin or envelope. The Woolworth Building, rising 800 feet in 1913, was one of the first real skyscrapers. Paul Goldberger, architecture critic for the New York Times, has called it the Mozart of skyscrapers, though it was originally described as the Cathedral of Commerce. Starting in New York City in 1925, the race for new rental space produced 15 buildings that year and an all-time record of 30 buildings the following year. The boom that lasted until 1931 adopted this style of architecture, Art Deco. Art Deco had a direct appeal to the senses. It entertained and drew in the public the same way films or the theater attracted a popular audience. The Channon, those landmarks of the city, the Chrysler, and the Empire State Building, the Waldorf Astoria, the McGraw-Hill, the Horn and Hardart restaurants, the GE Building, the RCA Building of Rockefeller Center, transforming the city into the Art Deco capital of the world.
Here, $1,500. That's $1,500 here now. $1,500.
Hello, Rudy. You want to buy a duck?
No, Joe, I don't want to buy a duck.
Why?
3,000.
Well, maybe your brother would like to have one, huh?
I haven't a brother.
Well, if you had one, you think he'd consider it?
1,400.
No.
Under no circumstances?
Under no circumstances.
You nasty man!
50, way back. 5. The $500 on that. 50. 6. 50. 7. 50. 8. 50. 9. Left. 1,000. Right. 1,100. 1,200. 1,300. 1,400. 15 now. $1,500 now. $600 to have, 7. And $700 for it, $800 payments, 900 for me, 1,000. 11, 12.
That troublesome conflict between the democratic spirit and the pursuit of wealth which so disturbed our founding fathers was never resolved. In laying out the Constitution, they were intent upon securing their rights, the rights of the industrious middle class against the claims of hereditary privilege through which an aristocracy had dominated Europe. In a sense, it was the political recognition or institutionalization of an established economic fact, that the industry of merchants and manufacturers was creating wealth and thereby more freedom for more people than the secure structures of government by which monarchs and noblemen ruled. The American obsession with luxury that so shocked European visitors and gave men like Franklin, Jefferson, and Adams pause was a result of the pursuit of the riches by so many that for so long had been the privilege of so few. Luxury, even as a goad to industry, inevitably produced more luxury. In New York and in America, the process became articulated quite apart from the product. Men were able to observe clearly how wealth was created and devise ways for themselves to participate in that process. Accurate observation, followed by diligent labor, and not the hereditary possession of riches, became the determining factor in economic success. The next great American fortunes, it seems, will not be made in shipping or in oil, steel or rails. Those enterprises which fueled the movement of people and goods across continents and seas, they will remain memorialized in a seaport museum, an historic railroad station, a skyscraper seemingly named for an automobile, and an Art Deco urban complex named for a millionaire. But they will not dominate the city's life or occupy its thoughts for longer than the exhalation of a sentimental sigh. In recent decades, New York's almost unseemly obsession with the acquisition and dissemination of information has become a national passion. Ignorance or lack of access to information is a sin in New York, perhaps the only sin. Poverty is despised because it implies ignorance and therefore indifference to our greatest social values. Mental and not physical mobility is the rising star of the new age. And once more, New York is at the heart of defining it, describing it, selling it, and of course, disdaining it, all at the same time.